Greetings, pairs, orphans, and retrogrades. Happy Monday of Holy Week, Holy Monday. Rules for Retrogrades on this Holy Monday is all too pleased to bring to you a special interview with a very, very esteemed guest, Eduard Habsburg, who is also known by his traditional title, Archduke Edward of Austria, a Hungarian diplomat and Hungary's current ambassador to the Holy See. He's also a member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, the former ruling family of Austria-Hungary, and he's been my friend behind the scenes for a number of years. I'm pleased to welcome to the show for the first time on Rules for Retrogrades, Eduard Habsburg. How are you, Eduard?
Thank you for having me on the show, Tim. It's been a long time. I'm very well on this Monday morning in Rome.
Excellent. This, judging by what's going on in Rome there, I was very happy to announce good news. As I woke up this morning, I looked at what would be the contemporaneous news from Rome, and there's no elimination of the TLM today on Holy Monday, as it was rumored here. And as ambassador to the papacy, I know you can't say too much, but can you confirm that the Tridentine Latin Mass has not been altered or abolished any time today in that single document that was released?
When we ambassadors want to find out what the Holy See releases, we go on the homepage of Vatican News, and then around 12 o'clock we check the Bollettino. And the Bollettino, in fact, had a document, but it had nothing to do with traditional Latin Mass. It was a different kind of document, so that is clear for us.
Beautiful. Perfect. Well, whatever it's on, the TLM is parish orphans and retrogrades out there. It is still intact, and this is nothing but good news. Edward, one of the many things that you and I have spoken about in the past is, before it was a book, the Habsburg Way. The Habsburg Way, whereupon you deliver 7 paths to happiness. I would call them paths to virtue. Your new book, The Habsburg Way, codifies all this. And would you say an introductory word on what is the Habsburg Way in a nutshell?
I was asked by an American friend whether I would write a book on the Habsburgs for Sophia Press. And I happened to have an idea how to write this book. I didn't want to write it as a pure history book where I sort of retell our family history once more, because there are very good books about the history of my family, and I'm not a historian. I thought I will look at the history of the Habsburgs through the lens of what can be considered the 7 principal ideas, values, rules that my ancestors always lived by. And it was an interesting process to find out what these 7 principles are. And I boiled them down to 7. At the beginning, I had 10, but some of them were rather weak clauses. So I finally boiled it down to 7, also because 7 is a nice number. And then what I did then is that I have 7 chapters where I take each of the topics, like family, like faith, like justice, etc. And I go through our family history and look at examples from the last 700 years of how Habsburg rulers and Habsburgs implemented these things in their time. Because, of course, the aim of the book in the end is to propose these 7 rules for our days and ask ourselves, why are they not around as much as they used to be? Why is something that was good in the past not considered good anymore today? And how much better could our world be if we would have a bit more of these 7 rules for turbulent times that I propose in my book? So that's in a nutshell what the book is about.
At the beginning of Western philosophy, Eduard, Plato and Aristotle sharply divided over the questions of some of these things you just mentioned: justice, scale of government and family, namely in family, how much headship individual fathers should exercise over their individual households. Plato, a lot of people don't know this. Plato thought the father should really not be connected to his own biological kids. The kids don't belong to the father, and by extension, the mother, Plato says. The kids should be able to be taken away from the father by the state. I'm sourcing book 5 of the Republic. And, the state really controls all for the good of the state. That's a large scale of government. Whereas Aristotle like everything Platonic, Aristotle rejected the teachings of his teacher. And Aristotle said, no, the child belongs to the father, and by extension, the mother. There's a natural friendship between the father and his son, just as there's between a king and his subject. It's actually a friendship. It's a friendship of unequals. It's not a friendship of equals, but that bond is lifelong. And the basic unit of society is not something that we would call political. It is the truly natural political cell of the family. This sounds familiar to Catholics because this grew into Catholic teaching. So Aristotle, not Plato, formed this strong Western tradition, the Catholic tradition of what we call as Catholics subsidiarity. Would you care to say a word to a bunch of my audience, retrogrades, parish orphans, traditionalists, have fallen under the spell in many cases of big government, rejections of subsidiarity? Would you say an initial word on why the Habsburg Way, even though it stands for monarchy in the minds of historians, really stands for subsidiarity?
I would begin with a quote from the 16th century. Charles V wrote to his son, and he explained to him how to govern, how to rule over several countries and nations. And he said, if you rule over several nations, you have to respect their languages, their habits, their rights, their laws, their different temperaments and characters. And if you don't do that, you're in for trouble. And why did the Habsburgs have this strong attitude of subsidiarity? And why did it go wrong whenever the Habsburgs didn't do that? When they followed the temptation of absolute control, centralism, and all of this? It is because when the Habsburgs, from being Rudolf von Habsburg in 1273, from being a count in the area of southwestern Germany, Switzerland, and France, suddenly was catapulted onto the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, he immediately had to juggle an incredibly complex construction of different nations, different languages, different dukedoms, different kings, all of them under the Holy Roman Emperor. You couldn't be a centralistic ruler. You couldn't rule by iron fist and by armies. It was from the beginning haggling, juggling, diplomacy, and with no real power. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had to convince by his authority, by his example, by being upright and standing for law and justice. And this remained the main line of the Habsburgs until the Austro-Hungarian Empire began. Then again, there were moments when the Habsburgs respected subsidiarity, and there were moments when they rejected it. And those were the bad moments in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And okay, subsidiarity, I don't have to explain to your readers because they know, is the principle that you respect the lower levels, or else that the higher level should not decide upon things that the lower level can better deal with. And of course, that means for the United States, this means that the state has precedence before the nation. And for the European Union, this means that the European Union has to respect all the rights, the languages, the habits, the morals of every single nation within this European Union. And this is, for instance, one of the problems that we have in the European Union right now. Concretely, my government, for instance, made a law a year ago where we decided that there was not going to be any publicity for gender ideology around schools. And Europe freaked out, and Brussels slapped us with punishment for that. But this is a classical case where you have to respect with subsidiarity. We acted according to our laws. This is all our decision. And but if you go against the mainstream, then you will get into trouble. So all of this plays into it. And the funny thing is, as I said, I just began with Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire. And then I made a detour via the United States and the way the US are built grassroots up from bottom. The smallest unit is the family. It's built on the family, on the homestead, on the township, and then on the state. That's the wonderful thing. You live in a place that, in my opinion, in our complicated and turbulent times, is one of the hopes of the world, because you're still a nation that respects the lower levels.
I want to talk about America and how it figures into the Habsburg Way in 1 second, but let me see what you think about this first. I think a lot of folks nowadays have fallen under the spell on the right wing of romanticizing big government, thinking, well, right wing shouldn't just mean small government. There should be a big government right wing sector as well. And yet I always point out to them, and I want to know on the cusp of what you just said, Edward, what you think of this notion. Anytime in European history, and you reflected this in your words on the Habsburgs, anytime they went wrong, that European leaders made a step against subsidiarity, acted in breach of subsidiarity. Anytime in America that something was done that by big federal central government, it was always a culturally leftist thing. It was always a bad thing. You can't give me, I'm a constitutional scholar in American law as well. And I say, tell me one good big government thing that was done from the federal government to the states. And when I consult Pope Pius XI, constitutional attorneys in America don't usually want to talk about that, but he confirms this principle. He says that not only is it inadvisable as a matter of practicality, to avoid breaches of subsidiarity. He says breaches of subsidiarity are a principle, part of the natural law. They're evil. And it's a grave evil to ever have a more far away government, a vaster government, do something that a more local government can do. When I consider these words of Pius XI, who coined the term subsidiarity, all of a sudden it makes much more sense when I listen to you say, or I recall myself saying the same thing, that there's never been one good instance of a breach of subsidiarity where something good did happen. There's no such thing as big government conservatism or right wing. Does that track with you?
I'll give you one example from my book and from the Habsburg history, where you can see this in detail. Empress Maria Theresia, she with the 16 children, she who had to take over a crumbling empire in the mid-18th century as a young girl, more or less. She managed to reconstitute the Habsburg Empire after a real crisis, and she won the trust of the Hungarians and of the other peoples of the empire by appealing to their help. And her son Joseph II, if you follow me on Twitter, you will see that he's not among my favorites, and I'm happy to report that he was just thrown out of the World Championship of the Habsburgs by Blessed Karl today. The results came in on Twitter, nearly 80 to 20. Joseph II decided, I want my Habsburg Empire to be like Prussia. His great idol was Frederick II of Prussia, was Enlightenment. And he decided, I want to have the same thing. I want to have a centralized state. We don't need local structures in Hungary, in Bohemia. We'll bring the crowns to Vienna, put them into the Schatzkammer, have one language, German, and we will rule everything from Vienna. That led to incredible trouble all over the monarchy, especially in Hungary. The Hungarians were furious that their rights were taken away, that their legal institutions were taken away, and there was unrest. There was unrest in the streets, and towards the end of his short 10-year reign, he realized that he had gone far too far and tried to do steps to put this back. What he had done is he had taken a beautiful, vibrant, and filigrane building of several nations with their own habits and tried to turn it into a centralized, unified state with decisions on the fate of a Hungarian peasant in the countryside being taken by someone in Vienna. And that's exactly what you say. The danger of even higher and higher and higher up levels deciding onto the fate of very, very local things. That's the problem of our world. That's the problem of globalization. And that is probably also what many people have seen in the last 2 or 3 years, where they have felt that things have been decided on a level that is far away from our life, but also far away from a democratic legitimation. People who are far above us seem to decide about our fates.
I always say to people, localism is to nationalism as nationalism is to globalism. Nationalism is better than globalism, but localism is better and more blessed and more natural, more a part of the natural law than nationalism even. Here's a pop quiz for you, Edward. See if you know this. Don't have shame if you don't, because no one gets it. Do you know the single sovereign world leader during the American Civil War that acknowledged as president Jefferson Davis, the president of the Southern Confederacy? Do you know who that was and why, if you do?
I should know, but I don't. I immediately concede defeat, please. Who was it?
I'm not trying to stump you. It was Blessed Pio Nono, Pius IX.
Oh,
and
yes.
You know why?
Yes.
It's because of what you just said now. And this is what I'm telling the big government conservatives here in America. I'm saying Pius IX hated the liberal nationalization of the unification forces of Italy. Like all the Italians in Rome to this day hate that building, which represents the unification of Italy right there on near the Roman Forum on Via Labicana. Right, they call it the wedding cake building. The American tourists do. It represents the big forcible unification of Italy, which stole property from the Papal States, from Pius IX, and forced the Vatican into big evil Rome. Big land swaths are worse. Bigger is worse. Bigger is not better. And he, of course, wrote a letter of consolation to Jefferson Davis and was the only sovereign that called him president, because he knew that aside from the slavery issue, the large issue in the Civil War was precisely what we're talking about. Should localities be able to retain their culture and decide for themselves?
Yes, it's very interesting. The other Habsburg that made a similar mistake was Franz Joseph. You know, Franz Joseph, who reigned for nearly 70 years. And he began, on horseback with a saber. And in the end of his reign, he saw the First World War trenches and airplanes. Incredible, unthinkable. But when he took over in 1848, the 1848 revolution rolled through Europe, and my forebearer, Archduke Stephen, he was in Hungary. He was on the side of the Hungarian revolutionaries. He tried to stand for their local rights, and he accompanied them to Vienna to ask the emperor to give them local rights. But of course, what the Hungarians wanted at that time was too much, because it would have blown the empire apart. So in the end, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed. The empire was reestablished, and for about 10 years, Franz Joseph didn't want to hear anything of subsidiarity, anything of local rights, and ruled with an iron fist. Then afterwards, after 1867, everything slowly got back together again. Hungary and Vienna got together, and they made the Ausgleich of 1867. But so you see, the temptation is always there. If there is chaos and order and unruliness, just have an iron fist, grab everything. But it's never a good thing. But don't quote me on American politics, because I'm not competent on this. I'm just rereading Tocqueville on the democracy in America.
Beautiful.
And yes,
it's such an excellent work. Well, no, but the point that I'm trying to draw out, that the Habsburg Way really impresses me with, is that these are universal principles that's been laid out by our church, namely Aristotle and St. Thomas, and eventually Pius IX, Pius XI, who gave us the term of subsidiarity, which insists that fathers must choose for their own household. The king's not, a good king's not going to take away the rights of the father, because the polity functions well when the household, which is a political unit, it is the single cell of society, as the Catechism says, when it operates well. So that's why there will not be instances of big government, faraway government, that strips the rights of local government, and the most local government is the household father, and does something good thereby. That's not it. We can resist trans and lambda, gamma, beta, theta, if you know what that is, those four letters, not by big government, national conservatism, but by localism. The local people don't want that. And local people choose for themselves, because fathers run their own households. I mean, Aristotle and St. Thomas insist, our two greatest teachers as Roman Catholics, Aristotle and St. Thomas, they insist that there are three good regimes, and you can pick which regime works best for your locality. They are basically subsidiarity executed by the one, that's a monarchy. Subsidiarity executed by the few, that's an aristocracy. And subsidiarity executed by the many, that's called a republic. And bad regimes are corrupted forms of each of these three, which take away subsidiarity, such that it just becomes rote rule by the one, tyranny. Monarchy becomes tyranny, or rote rule for power by the few. That is aristocracy becoming oligarchy, or rote rule by the many, where subsidiarity is lost, and republic or polity becomes a democracy, and it becomes evil. Every rule in your book, each of the seven, I haven't read the entire book, but each of the seven rules requires rule by household father, meaning we shouldn't overcome subsidiarity. It doesn't matter which of the three good forms of government we have. We should be with subsidiarity.
That's one of the points of the book. I meet quite a few people who dream of monarchy, and the American monarchists are, I think, the most enthusiastic and relaxed ones. Perhaps because the United States never had a monarchy, and there is no bad remembrance, except of course the principle to fight against tyranny that the United States were founded upon. But what I'm saying is, these principles that I speak about in my book can be applied everywhere. You don't need a monarchy for them to function. But what I say is that the first principle is get married and have lots of children. That's the first Habsburg rule. The second is be Catholic and practice your faith. What I say, be Catholic, of course, I draw my hat to my non-Catholic readers in the book, and I say I'm sorry if I'm a bit too enthusiastic about some of the measures that my ancestors took to ensure that everyone was Catholic. Nowadays, you probably wouldn't see this as ecumenical, but those were other times. then I say you have to believe in the empire and in subsidiarity, and the empire not being the empire of Star Wars, of a single ruler centralizing and ruling through terror and stormtroopers, but by subsidiarity. I say to stand for law and justice, and I also expand for your people. I have one chapter where I speak about how the future rulers were shaped to serve. So, you know, there is lots of advantages for a mere democracy and republic, but one of the advantages of monarchy is that a future ruler learns from his earliest childhood on to serve. You get a little glimpse of that when you look at the children of William and Kate growing up now, and see how they learn to serve by being present at events, by friendlily talking to people who are on the road, by their entire formation is to serve. Now, most of our politicians don't have this formation. You fight for the good of the nation or of your state, but of course you also fight for your person, for your family, and for your interests. And you have a political career, but afterwards you think, I will have a nice, cozy place somewhere in business and earn a lot of money. The monarch didn't have this privilege. He had to take over a job, he could never step out of it, and his son or his daughter would have to live with the consequences of his actions. And that's why I think the Habsburgs always stood for their subjects. Then I have one point which is called know who you are and live accordingly. This is the invitation to know your roots, your traditions. Then I have be brave in battle, because some of the Habsburgs were real fighters in battle, or else have a good general. That's my 6th rule. And the 7th rule is die well. This is the most important chapter of the book. I always say that the Habsburgs lived all their life with death before their eyes. They knew that not only would the way they die be watched, because it was a public thing, but they decided over their fate after death. They wanted to spend the rest of the eternity with God. They were very aware that they were weak, sinful people, and that they would have to account for what they did as state leaders. And that's why I also think that it's not that bad to have politicians and leaders who are people of faith, because A, I know by which criteria to judge them. B, I know that they will have to render one day accountability to God about what they did. And in my book, this makes them less in danger to be corrupt. So these 7 rules would be the ones that I take from Habsburg history, but they are rules that automatically flow from a Christian point of view, from the social teaching of the church, and from a just government. So yeah, not only in the Habsburg lands, but also in the United States today, and for every one of us.
Can you shed some light on that 7th rule, dying a happy death? A happy death is something, a blessed death, that's talked about frequently in the Catholic tradition, and it's usually associated with sacraments and sacramentals, you know, a supernatural path to a happy death. Are there any natural pointers that the Habsburg Way points out to us for attaining a happy death for ourselves and our families?
So, yeah, I think it doesn't really work without a supernatural or transcendent element. But I think that the central rule would be aware of your death, prepare for it, and live that you could die tomorrow and would have done the right thing before that. In Latin, you say quid agis prudenter agas et respice finem. Whatever you do, do it wisely and have the end in sight, in eyesight. The Habsburgs, on the one hand, they wanted to be an example to their people. On the other hand, they wanted to make it to heaven. So all their lives were focused on that. I give you 1 or 2 very touching examples. The husband of Empress Maria Theresia, he was Franz Stephan of Lothringen. He was a Freemason, the only we had in the family. And he was, probably Christian, but rather a humanistic type. And he was deeply, deeply impressed when smallpox came to Vienna. And that was in the 1740s. When smallpox came, That meant that you were either you died or you were disfigured for life, and all your beauty was gone. And smallpox arrived in the castle of the Habsburgs in the Hofburg. And he writes in a letter to a friend, he says, one of my daughters, who was 12 years old, learned that she had smallpox. Her first reaction was to call for a priest and to make a life confession. That was the first reaction. Not even, oh dear, am I going to die? I said, I want to make a confession. I want to put my things in order with God. She died 3 days later. But that was a first reaction. And that shows that they lived with death inside. And another one, for me, the most grandiose when it comes to death was Maximilian I, not the Mexican Maximilian, but the last knight. He lived in the 15th and 16th century. He was a grandiose, larger-than-life character. He wrote 3 autobiographies that were pimped up accounts of his own life as a knight. And he dreamt of being a knight 100 years after a knight had gone away. And he, in fact, he won the most beautiful princess of all of Europe by his courage. It's a very nice story. You have to read it one day. But when he died, he gave 3 instructions for his death that I think are absolutely magnificent. One of them was that after his death, his body was to be, his hair were to be shorn, his teeth were to be broken up, his body was to be flayed, and then he was to be exposed on a bier to be seen by everybody as a sign that the emperor is a poor sinner. Like everybody else, no glory. That was the first. The second was that he ordered his most beautiful coat of armor to be put into the church in Innsbruck, kneeling with his hands folded before the Blessed Sacrament. It is still there. If you go to Innsbruck and you go into the cathedral, in a side chapel, you have that kneeling coat of armor before the Blessed Sacrament. Now, a coat of armor. Armor cannot pray. It's a symbol. It's teaching the people what is important in life. And the third, and I saw that in a very special way a few months ago, he ordered for his body to be buried, not in a crypt, not on a cemetery, but under the steps of the church of Wiener Neustadt, in a way that his chest was exactly under the altar. So the priest, when he would lift the body of Christ, would be exactly above his chest. And in that way, people would pray for him after his death. And I've been there a few months ago. I've prayed in that church. I prayed for him, of course. So that's grandiose. But the most famous, of course, way that people get to know it, and you can watch it on YouTube if you want to. And I don't know, most of us, I would say half of humanity have watched the funeral of Queen Elizabeth of England. I did, most definitely. And there was a moment when her coffin was slowly lowered into the crypt, and they read out her titles while it was lowered. Now, the Habsburgs have a similar thing, but it's more Catholic, I would say. I've seen it twice, because when the last empress was buried and when Otto was buried, and you can see it on YouTube. You just Google Habsburg burial knocking ritual, and you will see it. The huge crowd arrives at the door of the Kapuzinergruft in Vienna in the center. And that's the crypt where they bring them. And then they knock on the door 3 times. And they say, from inside, the voice says, one of the monks says, "Who is there?" And then they say the title. Emperor Franz, Emperor of Austria, Hungary, King of Croatia, etc., etc. And the voice answers, "We don't know him." And then they read his achievements, and the voice again says, "We don't know him." And then they knock a 3rd time, and when the voice asks, "Who goes there? Who comes?" says, "Franz, a poor sinner." And then the door opens. So beautiful. Living with death in front of your eyes can make you humble, even in life, especially if you have a crown and are surrounded by riches.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's amazing. I mean, like you said, Eduard, the truest empire, this is not an overly abstract connection, by the way, is not like the vast empire from Star Wars. It's an emperor who serves the same purpose in his country that a proper aristocracy or republic does, which is just to help organize society in a way that the most souls can get to God. And that's not what Darth Sidious, the emperor in Star Wars, was all about. I love the name of that rule, by the way.
If you want to compare it to some science fiction novel, it would be closer to Dune, to the Dune novels. The emperor in the Dune novels has to juggle between the big houses, and he doesn't have the power over all of them. That was a bit like the Holy Roman Empire was.
I see. That's beautiful. We touched on it before. You kind of brought it up, the connection to America. I would say many Catholic traditionalists wrongly assumed that America was always the post-World War II liberal cesspool that it is today, I'm sad to say. So they'd be surprised to learn and to hear you speak in such tones that the Habsburgs were not staunch opponents of early America. That has something to do with what we've said in today's show about the Habsburg Way and subsidiarity. A good regime is one that stands for subsidiarity, right? Could you explain why? I remember I think it was November, you tweeted out that you're reading a book to this effect. I can't remember what the book was called, but would you say a word on it and what the Habsburg Way articulates?
The book is by Jonathan Singleton, and it's called The American Revolution and the Habsburgs. It came out last year. It's a fascinating read because it asks were the Habsburg lands influenced by what happened in the American Revolution? How was the American Revolution influenced by the Habsburgs? Something you would never expect. But before I go to that part, I would like to go back a few steps and say, before there were the Pilgrim Fathers and all that, there was an American history that was strongly Catholic. You had a strong influence of the Spanish Habsburgs. The first governor of Texas was put there by the Spanish Habsburgs. And in our family, we'd like to call California, Texas, and at least Florida old Habsburg territories. So we had very early touchings with America. Then, of course, the more recent history happened, and after the American Revolution, Singleton really proves that not only was what happened in America watched by the population of the Habsburg land, that at that time not only were Austria and Hungary, but also in the Netherlands, Belgium, where you had ports that played an important role during the war between England and the United States. They also played a role because they were courted by both sides. The English tried to get the Habsburgs to come on their side against the United States. But also, very interestingly, the moment the American Revolution happened was a time where the Habsburgs were opening up to Enlightenment ideas. Already Empress Maria Theresa, she was a bit more nervous, but of course her son Joseph II was quite interested in what happened in the States, and you had American representatives in Vienna that held circles and talked about what happened in the States. So it was the topic of the day in our monarchy. So I'm not a specialist for the book. I read it. I found it extremely interesting. I have to say, it also encouraged me to write The Habsburg Way, which is written for the American public, because I believe that Habsburg thought and American thought are far closer than one would think. And it was surprising for me to find out how close, in many ways, values in the United States and values of the Habsburg Empire are.
Edward, I don't know if you've read my first book, Catholic Republic, about America, but most people are surprised to learn that they've been sold at least a partially spoiled bill of goods when they hear Americans in their grade school that Jefferson and John Adams were looking to John Locke and Algernon Sidney. This is, of course, true. They were calling themselves neo-Whigs, and the original Whigs were Locke and Algernon Sidney and some other thinkers in England. But what they're not told is that John Locke and Algernon Sidney got all of their ideas about government, not about metaphysics. They have bad Enlightenment ideas about metaphysics and epistemology, but about government, that which the Americans took, all from Bellarmine, Suarez, Juan de Mariana, and the other school of Salamanca thinkers. In fact, Algernon Sidney, in many ways, the most important Whig thinker for Jefferson and Locke, even more Jefferson and Adams, even more important than Locke. Algernon Sidney was accused of plagiarizing Bellarmine, Cardinal Bellarmine, several times throughout his life, because people said Bellarmine had literally written the ideas against which the Anglican court theologian called Robert Filmer, who Jefferson and Adams hated, Filmer, Patriarchy, he wrote against Bellarmine. And so even though Locke and Sidney were Protestant Whigs, they favored the Catholic pre-Whig thought of Bellarmine and Suarez rather than the fellow Protestant loyalists, royalists like Robert Filmer. So there's a kink in history, and people associate early Americanism and the American Revolution with Enlightenment thought. Really, it's just a sort of bad reiteration during the Enlightenment of Bellarmine, Suarez, Juan de Mariana, and of course Thomas Aquinas, who supported revolutions in some cases. So I think that might help to glue together the parts that you were saying felt so disparate as you wrote the Habsburg Way.
Thank you, Tim. You really told me something there, and now I'm really regretting that I didn't take that class on political sciences in my university, but stuck to pure medieval philosophy. I see that I really have to do some reading on this here. I have to say that a world opened up to me while preparing this book and looking more into the way why America is a place where certain things are possible today. And I think it's a place against globalism. Although most people think that globalist ideas come mostly from the United States, it is also the soil where this can be fought by the way the United States are built. So we in Europe, we look to the United States with hope, I have to say.
Well, I'd love to send you a copy of Catholic Republic. It's got the whole story there. But for today, for today, I'm still waiting my full copy from the greatest Catholic publisher, I think, in the world, is the publisher of this book, Sophia Institute Press. They're the same publisher of Catholic Republic and my book, Case for Patriarchy. When can people get a copy of the Habsburg Way? Is that the third week of April, Edward?
Well, you would say so. The publishing date is the 18th of April, but many people who have pre-ordered it on the site of Sophia Institute Press have written back to me over Twitter saying it seems to be on the way. So I think you will get it quite a bit before if you order it directly from the Sophia Institute Press site. You just Google the Habsburg Way and Edward, and then you will find it immediately. It's really beautiful. I've just posted 2 days ago the first picture of the actual hard copy. It's beautiful. I don't have one. I just saw pictures so far. Because
We're going to put it up. We're going to put it up.
Until they cross the Atlantic, it'll take a long while. But I'm just saying, if you order it now, you might get it long before the publishing date.
Perfect. And usually Sophia gets it to buyers long before the publishing date. They're really good about that. And you're right, it is a beautiful cover, and we're gonna link to it in the show notes. Parish Orphans and Retrograde, so you can get a copy. Maybe I'm not promising anything. Maybe by week's end, if you order a copy of the Habsburg Way right now, you can go to the show notes and we'll have a copy of that.
Thank you very much, Tim. That is very generous, and I will be in the States beginning of May for a tour where I'm going to read in a few places, but it's mostly between Philadelphia, DC, and perhaps New York. But I'll be back, and I might be dropping in your part of the world.
No, I want Steph and I want to have you and your lovely wife to South Mississippi and show you some Southern hospitality, as we call it. I would be honored to meet you someday. We've had nice 2x2 telephone conversations, and we'd love to continue that over a cup of coffee or tea at our place. And
the same goes here. If you come to Rome, just give us a signal, and we'll take it from there.
Well, we might be there at the end of this year. So look, I'm pleased to have you on the show, and I'm pleased with the conversation we had today. I'm really excited about it. Honestly, The Habsburg Way is a book that people need to read. So everyone go out and buy a copy today. Everyone out there, I want to also bring to your attention that the first ever Ask Your Husband Women's Summit will air on this channel in 2 short days. It was behind a paywall last week, and Steph led this conference with 6 other amazing Catholic women. They had an amazing talk about what wifely submission really means. Guess what? No shockers. It means submission, and it means something really lovely that you're not being told when you hear about such fictive, made-up concepts like mutual submission. So we're gonna air that. We're gonna hang that set of interviews on this show in 2 short days, and we're really excited about that. Eduard Habsburg, my friend, thank you for appearing on the show today. If there's any final parting shots you want to take, please take them now.
Thank you, Tim, for having me. Love your show. Love America. See you soon again.
God bless you, my friend. Parishes of Retrogrades. Deus Volt. We'll see you on Wednesday with the Ask Your Husband Women's Summit. Peace.